The courtroom went still the moment they walked in. Not the ordinary quiet of a room waiting for a judge, not the tense silence before a verdict. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that falls when people sense something is about to shift, when the air in a room changes before anyone understands why. Two young white people moved down the center aisle with the deliberate calm of those who had prepared for this moment far longer than anyone in the room knew. The man was in his late 20s, lean and sharp-eyed, wearing a charcoal suit that had seen the inside of courtrooms across 3 states. 7 wrongful convictions overturned. His name was Connor, and he had not slept in 31 hours. The woman beside him carried a leather satchel thick with documents and a recorder she had not turned off since the night before. Lily was a year younger than her brother, and in the past 4 years alone she had broken 3 corruption rings that reached all the way to the state capitol. They were not here to observe. At the defense table, a black man in his early 50s sat with his hands folded in front of him. James Calloway had the hands of someone who had worked with them every day of his adult life, wide across the knuckles, marked with old grease that no amount of scrubbing fully removed. He was dressed in a collared shirt that someone had ironed for him, though he could not remember who. He had been in county lockup for 19 days. He had not asked Connor or Lily to come. He had, in fact, asked them not to. He looked up when they entered, and for just a moment something moved across his face that he quickly put away. Lily sat down beside him and placed her hand over his without a word. Connor set his briefcase on the table, clicked it open, and looked at the prosecutor across the room the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. The charge was murder in the 1st degree, and the story of how James Calloway ended up at that table and how the 2 people beside him ended up in that courtroom began not with a crime but with a cold night and a broken-down truck. 21 years before, James had not been looking for anything the night he found them. It was late October, and the temperature in Harlan, Georgia, had dropped faster than anyone expected. He had stayed past his shift at Ridgeline Transport to finish a brake job on a delivery truck that needed to go out first thing in the morning. The shop smelled of motor oil and rust, and the particular metallic cold that settles into a workspace when the heat is cut off at 5 in the afternoon. James worked in that smell so often it had become, to him, something close to comfort. He was locking up the back supply bay when he heard it, a sound so small he almost dismissed it. A shuffle, then silence. Then, from somewhere behind the row of decommissioned vehicles, lined up against the back fence, a cough that someone was clearly trying to suppress. James stood still. He had grown up in a town where stillness was a skill, where you learned early that the world offered you fewer second chances than it offered other people, so you paid attention the first time. He set down his keys and walked toward the sound. The truck was a late 90s flatbed that had been sitting on flat tires for 2 years. The passenger door was cracked open just enough for 2 small bodies to fit through. The boy came out first. He was 8 years old, though he looked older in the way that children look older when they have been frightened for a long time. He positioned himself in front of the door before James could look inside, and he held a small folding knife, the kind used for peeling fruit, in a grip that was far too tight for the blade to be useful, but that communicated everything it needed to communicate. James stopped walking. He kept his hands where the boy could see them. Behind the boy, barely visible in the dark, a smaller child sat with her knees pulled to her chest. She was clutching something. A jacket, James would later understand. Her mother's jacket, which she had not let go of in 3 weeks. He crouched down so he was not standing over the boy. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I am not going to take anything from you." The boy did not lower the knife, but he did not move forward either. His name was Connor. His sister was Lily. Their parents had died in a 2-car collision on a rural highway 22 days earlier. A drunk driver had crossed the center line at 11:15 on a Thursday night, and by the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing left to do. Connor had been told this by a social worker who spoke quickly and looked at her clipboard more than she looked at him. Their only living relatives, an aunt in Florida and a great-uncle in Tennessee, had declined to take them. The official language was unable to provide appropriate care. The practical reality was simpler and uglier than that. They had been placed in a county transitional shelter. 3 days earlier, Connor had overheard two staff members talking in the hallway. The system was at capacity, one had said. The kids would have to be split up and placed in separate facilities until long-term placements could be arranged. Connor had waited until 2 in the morning, taken Lily by the hand, and walked out. He had no plan beyond one principle. They would not be separated. They had been sleeping in the truck for 2 nights. James called the county social services office from the shop phone. He stood near the truck while he waited, close enough that the children could see him, far enough that they did not feel crowded. The caseworker who arrived 40 minutes later was a tired woman who had been doing this job for 16 years and had long since learned to move through difficult situations efficiently. She was not unkind. She was simply operating within a system that had taught her to process rather than linger. She explained, in the clinical shorthand of someone who had said similar things many times, that the 2 children would be transported to separate facilities that night and reassessed for joint placement within the coming weeks, depending on availability. Connor heard the word separate, and something in his face changed. He looked at James, not at the caseworker, not at the ground, at James, and he said, "Please don't let them take her away from me." James had spent 8 years since his wife's death becoming very good at not feeling things in the moments when feeling them was inconvenient. He had built that skill carefully, the way you build anything that is meant to hold weight. He kept his expression steady. He looked at the caseworker. He said, "What would it take for me to keep them together tonight?" What followed was not simple. Nothing about what James did in the weeks after that night was simple. The paperwork alone was a process designed, it seemed, to exhaust people into giving up. Home inspections, financial reviews, background checks that went back further than most people's living memory, questions about his neighborhood, his income, his social life, his faith, his routines, questions that were phrased neutrally, but that carried, beneath them, a subtext James recognized immediately and had been recognizing his entire life. A black man, single, working class, living in the east side of Harlan, wanting to take in 2 white children. The system did not say it was wrong. It simply made the process long enough and difficult enough that a man with less endurance might have concluded it was not worth it. James had no illusions about what he was walking into. He had grown up understanding that certain doors required more knocking. He had learned, the way black men in small southern towns learn, to keep his voice level, his paperwork perfect, and his patience longer than the room expected. He had also learned that none of that guaranteed anything. It only meant you had done everything right when the wrong thing happened anyway. He wanted to walk away. There were mornings during those weeks when he sat at his kitchen table before dawn and asked himself, honestly, what he was doing. He was in his early 30s. He had a 2-bedroom house he owned outright and a truck with 200,000 miles on it. He made enough to cover his needs and a modest amount beyond that. He was not a man of surplus, and underneath all of that was the thing he could not say to the caseworkers or the review board. He was terrified, not of the paperwork, not of the cost. He was terrified of what it meant to love someone again. His wife had been gone for 8 years, and the grief had settled into something manageable, something he had learned to carry without being crushed by it. But he knew, the way you know things you never say out loud, that if he brought these children into his life and let himself care about them the way a father cares, he would be standing at the edge of the same cliff again. And if he ever lost them, the way he had lost her, he would not find his way back a second time. He sat with that fear. He did not let it decide. After 4 months of reviews, 2 formal hearings, and 1 afternoon in which a county official asked him with genuine puzzlement whether he had considered the cultural adjustment the children might face living with him, James Calloway was granted foster placement of Connor and Lily, with adoption proceedings to follow. He drove home that evening and sat in the parking lot of his house for a long time before going inside. In the back seat, Connor sat with his backpack on his lap. Lily was asleep against his shoulder. The house was small. James had spent the previous 3 weekends converting the attic space above the 2nd bedroom into a proper room, insulated and painted, with a window he had cut himself and framed with wood he bought second-hand. He had built a desk for Lily out of an old door and 2 sawhorses sanded smooth. For Connor, He had cleared a corner of the garage and set up a workbench, because the boy had asked once, quietly, whether he could watch James work on the truck. That first night, he showed them the rooms. Lily ran her hand along the edge of the desk and looked up at him with an expression he could not fully read. Connor stood in the doorway of the attic room with his backpack still on. He looked at the bed. He looked at the window. He looked at James. He said, "When it gets hard, you will send us away, right?" James did not answer immediately. He had learned, in those 4 months, that quick reassurances meant nothing to children who had been reassured and then disappointed. Words were cheap. Connor knew that already. James pulled a chair from the hallway and set it outside the door of the room. He sat down in it. He said, "Get some sleep." He stayed there through the night. When the house was quiet and both children were breathing slowly in the darkness, he sat with his hands on his knees and listened to the sound of rain on the roof. In the morning, Connor came out and found him still there, still in the chair, still present. The boy stood in the doorway for a long moment. He did not say anything. He went to the bathroom, washed his face, and came back to find James making eggs in the kitchen. It was the first morning of the rest of it. The first time a stranger called the police on James Calloway for being with his own children. Lily was 7 years old. It was a Saturday in June, and James had taken the two of them to Riverside Park on the edge of town. He sat on a bench with a paperback he had been trying to finish for 3 weeks, while Connor and Lily played near the water. He was perhaps 30 feet away. He could see them clearly. Lily was trying to catch crawfish with her bare hands, failing, and finding this funnier each time. Connor was showing her a technique that was equally unsuccessful but delivered with the authority of an older brother who had no idea what he was doing. James was watching them when he noticed the woman. She was standing near the picnic tables with a phone to her ear, looking not at her own children but at his, looking at him, then back at them, then at him again. He recognized the arithmetic she was running. He had seen it before. 12 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. They were professional about it. James understood that they were, in their own way, trying to be decent. They asked for identification. They asked about his relationship to the children. He handed them the folder he had started carrying, a manila envelope, slightly worn at the corners now, containing the foster placement order, the official letter from the county family court, and a 1-page summary he had typed himself that explained the arrangement in plain language. He had made the folder after the second time a hospital receptionist had demanded additional documentation before allowing him to sign the intake form for Connor's sprained wrist. He had understood then that this was going to be a recurring requirement of his life, and he had decided to meet it with preparation rather than argument. The officers looked at the paperwork. They looked at James. One of them handed the folder back and said they were sorry for the interruption. James nodded. He put the folder back in the side pocket of his jacket. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain what the experience felt like. He called Connor and Lily over, told them it was time for lunch, and walked them to the truck. Later that night, after the children were in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the folder for a long time. He thought about what it meant to be a man who had to carry proof of his own family. He put the folder in his jacket pocket, where it would stay for the next decade and a half. He was not a perfect father. He would have been the first to say so. He did not always know what to say when Connor came home from school with the particular kind of silence that meant something had happened that he was not ready to talk about. He did not know, at first, how to help Lily process grief, real grief, the kind that does not resolve on a schedule. There were evenings when he made the wrong dinner and evenings when he said the wrong thing, and one memorable afternoon when he tried to explain long division in a way that was so confusing it made Lily cry, which made Connor laugh, which made Lily cry harder, which eventually made all 3 of them sit on the kitchen floor laughing until their stomachs hurt. What he gave them was not perfection. It was consistency. He showed up. Every morning, without exception, he was in the kitchen before they woke up. He learned Connor's preference for eggs scrambled hard and Lily's habit of eating cereal dry because she did not like the way milk made it go soft. He went to every school event he was permitted to attend, even the ones that required him to take a half day from work. He sat through 2 school concerts, 1 disastrous science fair. and 4 years of youth soccer in which Connor's team lost the majority of their games with a passionate commitment that James found, privately, admirable. He did not ask them to call him Dad. He had thought about it and turned the question over many times in the first year, wondering whether to bring it up or leave it alone. He had decided to leave it alone. He told them once, plainly, "The name does not matter. What matters is that you know you have a home." Lily started calling him Dad sometime around her 9th birthday. Not as a declaration. It simply slipped out one afternoon when she was asking him to help with something, and neither of them commented on it. And after that it was just the word she used. Connor took longer. Connor was 16 when it happened. The award was for academic achievement, top marks in his sophomore class, recognized at an evening ceremony in the school gymnasium that James had attended in the same collared shirt he wore to every formal occasion, pressed the night before. He had arrived early and taken a seat near the aisle so he could see clearly. Connor accepted the award with the careful composure of a teenager who was slightly uncomfortable with public attention but had decided to handle it well. James watched from his seat and felt something that he had no adequate word for. Something adjacent to pride, but older and quieter than pride. Afterward, in the corridor outside the gymnasium, James was waiting when a man in a golf shirt approached Connor. The man had the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most comfortable person in any room. He looked at Connor, then looked past him at James with brief, assessing eyes. He said to Connor, "Nice work tonight. Is that your driver?" Connor froze. James was close enough to hear. He watched his son's face go through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, then shame, then calculation, and then a kind of collapse that James recognized as the moment a person chooses the easier path. Connor said, "He is just my guardian." The man nodded and moved on. James stood still. He did not move toward Connor. He did not change his expression. He waited until the corridor had thinned out, then walked to where Connor was standing and said, simply, that it was time to go home. They drove in silence. That night, after Connor had gone upstairs, Lily came to find James in the kitchen. She had heard what happened. Connor had told her, in the way siblings tell each other the things they cannot tell parents, through closed doors and lowered voices. Lily was angry in the clean, uncomplicated way that 14-year-olds are angry when the world fails to meet their standards. She said, "He should not have done that." James said, "He is 16. He is scared." That is not an excuse. James looked at her. "No," he said, "it is not an excuse, but it is a reason. There is a difference." He did not go upstairs that night. He gave Connor the space the boy needed, because James understood, in his body, in the specific way you understand things that have happened to you, what it felt like to be in a room where your existence was an inconvenience to someone else's comfort. He did not want Connor to be ashamed of that fear. He wanted him to eventually be strong enough to act against it. 3 days later, he found Connor in the garage, sitting on an overturned crate next to the truck. James got his tools and started working. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Connor said, "I am sorry." James kept his hands on the engine. "I know. I was not ashamed of you." Connor stopped. He set his hands flat on the workbench and looked at them. "I was ashamed of myself, because I could not say it, because I stood there, and I let it happen." James set down the wrench. He wiped his hands on the shop rag and sat down on the edge of the truck's bumper and looked at the boy, this boy who was not his by blood or by law originally, who had come to him frightened and guarded and carrying a useless knife in the dark, and who had become, over 8 years, one of the 2 most important people in his life. He said, "Being afraid does not make you a coward, but if you let fear do your choosing for you, you will lose the people who love you, not all at once, slowly, one moment at a time." Connor was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to learn how to fight for people who cannot fight for themselves." James nodded. "That is a good thing to want. I think I want to be a lawyer." James picked up the wrench again. "Then be a good one." Lily had known since she was 12 what she wanted to do. James had given her a small voice recorder for that birthday, a simple thing, secondhand, that he had found at a church sale and cleaned up and put new batteries in. She had wanted one since she started keeping notes on everything around her, conversations, observations, things she overheard and wanted to remember. He had noticed her writing in a notebook at the kitchen table one evening and asked what she was working on. "I am writing down what really happened," she had said, with the absolute seriousness of a child who has decided something important. James had understood, in that moment, what she meant. She was writing down the truth as she saw it, as a record against the version of events that other people would try to impose. She became a journalist, not by accident, but by intention, the way Lily did everything. 21 years after the night in the parking lot of Ridgeline Transport, Connor was 29 years old and had more experience in a courtroom than lawyers twice his age. Lily was 27 and had published work that had ended careers and opened investigations. They had both left Harlan, Connor to Atlanta and Lily to a news organization based in Savannah, and they called James regularly, though not as often as they would have if they had understood how much he looked forward to those calls. James did not tell them that. He had spent those 21 years teaching them to be capable and independent, and he had succeeded, and the particular loneliness of having succeeded did not seem like something he should burden them with. He was still at Ridgeline, still doing the same work, in the same shop, with the same smell of oil and rust and cold metal. His back hurt more than it used to. He moved more carefully than he once had. When the children asked how he was, he said he was fine. He was fine. He was also, in the fall of that 21st year, the only person at Ridgeline Transport paying close attention to a pattern of falsified injury reports that had been building for at least 3 years. The man at the center of it was Derek Harmon, the floor manager. Harmon was not a complicated villain. He was the kind of man who had been given a small amount of power and had discovered that power, when left unexamined, tends to expand into whatever space is available. The scheme was straightforward. When workers at Ridgeline were injured on the job, Harmon, in coordination with the owner Frank Aldridge, would delay the official incident report, pressure the injured worker to sign a statement accepting personal responsibility for the accident, and then submit falsified documentation to the insurance company indicating the injury had occurred off-site. The workers, most of them immigrants, most of them without strong English, all of them dependent on the job, rarely fought back. The few who tried found their hours cut and their assignments changed until they quit. James had watched this happen 3 times in 2 years. The third time, the worker was a young man named Marco Reyes, who had caught 2 fingers in a conveyor mechanism that had been flagged for maintenance and never repaired. Marco's hand required surgery. Harmon told him, the day after the surgery, that if he wanted to keep his job and his health insurance, he would sign the statement. Marco had a wife and a daughter who was 4 years old. He signed. James had seen the original maintenance flag. He had seen the unsigned repair order. He had seen Marco's face the morning after he signed the statement. He began, carefully and quietly, to collect evidence. He could not write notes easily on the job. His hands were always covered in grease, and paperwork left in the shop had a way of disappearing. So he used his phone the same way he had always used it. He recorded himself thinking out loud, narrating what he had seen, when he had seen it, and where the documentation was. It was not a sophisticated system. It was the system available to him. He also, on 2 occasions, confronted Derek Harmon directly. The second confrontation, James recorded without Harmon's knowledge. He had planned to deliver the full file to an attorney in Augusta on a Tuesday morning in November. On Monday night, Derek Harmon was found dead in the parts storage room at the back of the Ridgeline facility. He had been strangled. The scene had been arranged carefully to suggest a confrontation that had turned violent. The real killer was Deputy Ray Colton, a local law enforcement officer who had been on Frank Aldridge's payroll for years. Harmon had begun showing signs of wanting to come forward. Colton had been sent to make certain that did not happen, but James did not know any of that yet. What he knew was that every piece of evidence pointed at him. His entry card had been logged in the storage area at 11:40 in the evening. A security camera near the storage room had captured footage of a figure in a Ridgeline work jacket moving along the side corridor. A co-worker named Pete Solis told investigators that James had made threatening comments about Harmon in the break room. James's documentation file was gone from the lockbox under his workbench. A pair of his work gloves, taken from his locker, tested positive for Derek Harmon's blood. James was arrested on a Wednesday morning in the parking lot of the grocery store in front of 3 other shoppers and a stock boy who later told someone he knew about it. By the weekend, the town of Harlan had largely made up its mind. In the county jail, in a cell that was quieter than James expected, he sat on the edge of the cot and did not sleep. He was not thinking about the evidence. He was not building arguments in his head or calculating his options. He was thinking about a night 21 years ago when he had sat in a wooden chair outside a child's bedroom and listened to rain on a roof and decided, without being able to fully explain why, that staying was what his conscience required. He thought about Connor's backpack on the floor. He thought about Lily's hand on the edge of the desk he had built for her. The fluorescent light above his cot hummed at a frequency that made thinking difficult. The air in the cell smelled of disinfectant and old concrete and the specific stale coldness of a place that is cleaned but never truly aired out. He lay back and stared at the ceiling and heard, somewhere far down the corridor, a door close. He thought, if he fought this, it would consume everything Connor and Lily had built. Their names would be in every article. Their connection to him would be used, in the way connections are used, to imply guilt by association. Connor's clients would wonder. Lily's editors would hesitate. He asked for the paperwork for a plea agreement. He did not tell Connor or Lily he had asked for it. He did not expect them to come. Connor found out about the plea agreement on a Thursday evening from a paralegal in the Augusta Public Defender's office who had worked 2 cases with him and trusted him enough to make an unofficial call. She said, "Your father's appointed counsel is recommending he take the deal. 12 to 15, possibility of parole in 8. He has not said no." Connor stood in the middle of his Atlanta apartment with his phone pressed to his ear and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "When is the pre-trial conference?" "Monday." He called Lily before he had set his phone down. Lily was in Savannah, 3 hours into editing a piece that was due the following morning. She listened to Connor without interrupting. When he finished, she closed her laptop, picked up her keys, and said, "I will meet you in Harlan tomorrow night." Connor said, "He is going to tell us not to come." Lily said, "I know." She was already at the door. They arrived at the jail on a Friday afternoon. James was brought into the visitation room and looked at his children across the table with an expression that was composed in the way that expressions are composed when a person has been working on them for days. He said, "I told you both not to come." Connor sat down. He placed a legal pad on the table in front of him. He said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." James set his hands flat on the table and looked at them. "Connor, listen to me. I have thought this through. If I take the deal, you and Lily keep what you have built. Nobody drags your names through this. You move forward. That is what I want." Connor looked up from the legal pad. He set the pen down. He looked at his father the way James had once looked at him, across a garage workbench, on a night when the words that needed saying were difficult and necessary. He said, "You told me that if you let fear do your choosing for you, you lose the people who love you, one moment at a time. You said that to me. In our garage." James said nothing. Then Lily said, more quietly than Connor, "Dad, we know you are trying to protect us. We need you to stop." James looked at her. She said, "You sat outside our door all night, so we would know you were not going to leave. Do you remember that?" He said, "I remember." "Then you know we are not leaving either. So please, tell us what happened." James talked for 2 hours. He told them about Marco Reyes and the unsigned maintenance order. He told them about 3 years of watching workers sign away their rights in small offices with the door closed. He told them about the documentation he had gathered and where he had kept it and the fact that it was gone. He told them about the confrontations with Harmon and about the second one that he had recorded. Connor's pen did not stop moving. When James finished, Connor looked up and said, "The recording, where was it?" "On my phone. They took my phone when they booked me. It would have been copied to evidence. If it exists, it is in the case file." Connor made a note. "What about backups? Old email? Anything?" James shook his head slowly. Then he stopped. He said, "I sent one clip to an old email address. I was testing whether the quality was good enough, and I sent it to check the file size." He paused. I do not know if I deleted it afterward. Connor wrote that down and underlined it twice. Lily was watching James with the focused attention she brought to sources who were telling the truth. She said, "The entry card data. Is it managed internally or through a third-party system?" Third party, a company called Secure Path. They handle all of Ridgeline's access logs. Lily wrote the name in her notebook. Then James said, with the careful steadiness of a man delivering something he had prepared, "I want you to listen to me. I have had a full life. I have done work I am proud of, and I raised 2 children who turned out better than anything I deserved. If I fight this and lose, I spend the rest of my life in prison, and the 2 of you spend the next 5 years tied to this case. If I take the deal, you keep your futures intact. That is worth more to me than fighting." Stop. Connor's voice was not loud, but it had the quality of something that does not move. He looked at his father steadily. "You taught us that what was true was worth standing for, even when standing cost something. You did not teach us that by saying it. You taught us by doing it, every single day, for 21 years. So I need you to understand what you are asking us to accept right now." He paused. "You are asking us to walk away from you. We are not going to do that." The room was very quiet. Lily reached across the table and covered James's hand with hers. After a long time, James said, "Do not lose." Connor picked up his pen. "We will not." They worked out of the house on Clement Street, James's house, which smelled, as it always had, of motor oil and old wood, and the particular domestic warmth of a home that has been lived in carefully over many years. Connor sat up at the kitchen table. Lily took the back bedroom that had been hers, though she spent most of the first night in the garage, going through the storage boxes James had kept under the workbench. Connor's first call was to a digital forensics contact in Atlanta, who agreed to look at the Secure Path access log data as soon as Connor could obtain it. His second call was to the public defender's office to announce that he was taking over as James's counsel of record, which produced a tense conversation with the appointed attorney, who had been working the case in good faith and was not entirely wrong that Connor's involvement would complicate things. Connor understood this. He also understood that complicated was better than finished. The access log discrepancy took the forensics contact less than 4 hours to identify. The Secure Path system used a sequential timestamp architecture, meaning that every entry in the log was assigned a value derived from the previous entry. It was a design intended to prevent tampering. What it also meant was that when someone went into the log and inserted a false entry, placing James's card in the storage area at 11:40 in the evening, they had disrupted the sequence. The inserted timestamp was technically consistent with the time shown but numerically out of order by a margin that was small enough to miss on a casual review and significant enough to be unambiguous to someone who knew what they were looking for. Connor read the forensics report at 2 in the morning and sat very still for a moment. Then, he went to the back bedroom and knocked on the door. Lily was awake. She had been going through James's stored work phone, an older model he had stopped using 8 months ago that she had found in a box of miscellaneous cables and chargers, with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that evidence does not announce itself. Connor told her what the report said. She nodded without looking up from the phone. He said, "Anything?" She said, "Maybe. Give me an hour." The voice memo application on James's old phone showed 43 deleted files. Standard deletion on that model did not overwrite the data immediately. It flagged the storage blocks as available for reuse, but left the underlying data intact until those blocks were needed for something new. In 8 months of sitting in a box, the phone had taken no new recordings, updated no applications, done nothing that would have prompted the system to reuse those blocks. Lily called a technical producer at her news organization who talked her through the recovery process over the phone, file by file, while Connor sat at the kitchen table pretending to review deposition notes and actually listening to every word. 41 of the 43 files were unrecoverable, overwritten or fragmented past the point of reconstruction. 2 were intact. The first was James narrating a list of dates and incident numbers in the flat, factual tone of a man documenting things carefully. Connor listened to it and noted the 3 incident numbers that did not appear anywhere in the official Ridgeline insurance filings. The second was the confrontation. They listened to it together at the kitchen table at 3:40 in the morning, James's recorded voice coming through the small speaker with the slight compression of a phone recording made in a large room. James, I have documentation on 6 incidents going back to February of last year. I am going to take that documentation to an attorney. I am telling you directly because I believe you have enough sense to understand what that means for you. Harmon, you think you understand what you are doing. You do not. James, I understand exactly what I am doing. Harmon, the people above me, Frank, the others, they will not let this go quietly. You should think very carefully about whether you want to be the one who kicks this over. Because once it starts moving, it does not stop. And you are not the kind of man they worry about making an example of. A pause. Approximately 4 seconds. James, I have been the kind of man people do not worry about making an example of my entire life. That has never stopped me from doing what was true. Lily stopped the recording. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Connor said, very quietly, he knew they might come after him. He knew and he did it anyway. Lily nodded. She looked at the phone for a moment. Then she looked up and said, he was trying to protect Marco and the others the same way he protected us. Connor was quiet. Then he said, find me everything you can on Frank Aldridge. And find out who else is connected to him. Lily spent the next 6 days doing the work she had been trained to do. She found 4 former Ridgeline employees who had left the company in the past 3 years, all of whom had filed and then withdrawn workers' compensation claims. 2 agreed to speak on background. 1 agreed to go on record. She traced the falsified insurance filings through the carrier and found a pattern of claim denials that corresponded precisely with the dates on James's recovered incident list. She found that the adjuster who had processed the majority of those denials had received payments from a consulting company that did not appear to have any other clients, and that the consulting company had been registered by a law firm that also handled Frank Aldridge's personal estate planning. She found Pete Solis. Pete Solis was 61 years old. He had worked at Ridgeline for 11 years. He had a daughter in her 2nd year at a nursing program in Macon. Her tuition and housing were being paid by a scholarship fund administered through a nonprofit that shared a registered address with one of Frank Aldridge's holding companies. Lily sat with that information for a long time before she brought it to Connor. When she did, Connor read through her notes without speaking. Then he said, he is not a bad man. He is a man who was given a way out of an impossible situation and took it. Lily said, I know. Connor said, that does not make his testimony less damaging. Lily said, no, but it means there might be a way to give him the same choice. Marco Reyes was living in a rental house on the south side of Harlan with his wife and his daughter, who was now 5 years old. He opened the door when Lily knocked, recognized her after a moment, and did not immediately close it, which she took as a sign. She did not record the conversation. She sat at his kitchen table with her notebook closed and told him what she knew and what she needed. Marco listened. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands, the right one, where the 2 fingers that had been surgically repaired had healed slightly crooked, the way repaired things sometimes do. He said, if I say something, Aldridge will know it was me. My wife's job is through a contractor Ridgeline uses. Lily said, I know. My daughter. I know. She paused. I am not going to tell you the risk is small. It is not. I am not going to promise you nothing bad will happen, because I cannot promise that. She stopped for a moment. The man sitting in county jail right now spent 21 years of his life making sure 2 kids who had nobody ended up okay. He did that when there was nothing in it for him, and every reason not to. He did it because it was the only honest choice he could live with. She looked at Marco steadily. I am not asking you to risk your family for him. I am only asking you not to let them bury another person who did nothing wrong. Whatever you decide, I will understand. She left her number and drove back to Clement Street. Marco called her on the 3rd day. He said, tell me what I need to do. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in November, in the Harlan County Courthouse, a building that smelled of old wood and floor wax, and the particular institutional stillness of a place where consequential things happen routinely enough to become ordinary. The prosecution's case was presented by Assistant District Attorney Patricia Weld, who had been trying cases in Harlan County for 14 years and who was, by any reasonable measure, good at her job. She was organized, methodical, and possessed of the kind of courtroom confidence that comes not from arrogance but from preparation. She had a strong case. She knew it. Connor knew it too. Weld's opening statement lasted 38 minutes. She walked the jury through the physical evidence with the patience of someone building a structure that was meant to hold weight. The entry card log, the security footage, the blood on the work gloves, the testimony of Pete Solis, who had heard James make threatening statements about Derek Harmon in the weeks before the murder. She described James Calloway as a man with motive who had chosen to eliminate a threat rather than face the consequences of his own actions. She used the word calculated. She used it 3 times. Connor's opening statement lasted 11 minutes. He did not use notes. He said, "The evidence in this case was not discovered. It was placed. Every piece of it, the log entry, the footage, the gloves, was constructed by people with the resources to construct it, and the motive to need a different man to be responsible for what happened in that storage room. My job over the next several days is not to ask you to take my word for that. My job is to show you, piece by piece, how it was done, and when I am finished, I am going to ask you to ask yourselves one question. Not whether James Calloway is the kind of man capable of violence, but whether the evidence you have been shown actually proves he committed this crime, or whether it was designed to make you believe he did." He paused. There is a difference between those two things. The entire justice system depends on that difference. He sat down. The prosecution's first 3 days were efficient and damaging. Weld put the Ridgeline security supervisor on the stand to walk through the entry card log. She put the forensics technician on the stand to discuss the blood evidence. She put 2 deputies on the stand to establish the timeline of the discovery of Derek Harmon's body and the subsequent investigation. Connor cross-examined each witness carefully and without visible urgency. He asked the security supervisor about the secure path system's architecture, specifically about the sequential timestamp structure, and watched the man's confidence falter when Connor produced the forensics report and asked him to explain the numerical anomaly on page 7. The supervisor said he was not a technical expert on the system's internal structure. Connor said he understood and moved on. He asked the forensics technician about the gloves, specifically about the chain of custody and whether the technician could confirm the gloves had been in James's possession continuously from the time they were logged at the facility to the time they were tested. The technician said he could confirm the chain from the point of evidence collection. Connor asked about before that point. The technician said that was outside his area of testimony. Connor said he understood and moved on. He was not trying to win the cross-examinations. He was building a structure of his own, one that would support the weight of what was coming. Pete Solis took the stand on the 4th day. He was a small man who had grown smaller since the investigation began, in the way that people who are carrying something too heavy for them gradually compress under the weight. He answered Weld's questions in a flat, careful voice. He described 2 specific instances in which James had said that Harmon would answer for what he was doing to people. Connor stood up for cross-examination and began from a place of apparent calm. He established that Pete and James had worked together for over a decade without incident. He established that Pete had never seen James behave violently toward anyone. He established that the phrase, "answer for what he was doing," could reasonably refer to legal accountability rather than physical harm. Then he said, "Mr. Solis, is your daughter currently receiving financial assistance for her education through a scholarship fund connected to a nonprofit registered at the same address as one of Frank Aldridge's holding companies?" Weld objected. The judge asked Connor to establish relevance. Connor said, "I intend to demonstrate that the witness's testimony has been materially shaped by financial arrangements provided by individuals with a direct interest in the outcome of this case, and that Frank Aldridge, not James Calloway, is at the center of what happened at Ridgeline Transport." The judge said, "Proceed." Connor walked Pete Solis through the scholarship fund, the nonprofit, the registered address, the connection to Aldridge's companies. He did it methodically, document by document, each exhibit entered into the record before the next question was asked. Pete's answers became shorter as the questioning continued. His hands, visible on the rail of the witness stand, became very still. At the end, Connor said, "Mr. Solis, were you ever directly told that your daughter's scholarship was contingent on your cooperation with the investigation into James Calloway?" A long pause. Pete said, "Not in those words." Connor said, "But you understood that to be the case." Another pause. Longer. Pete said, "Yes." Connor said, "And were you ever threatened, directly or indirectly, with consequences if you did not cooperate?" Pete looked at the table in front of him. Then he looked up and looked at James, and the look was not hostile, and it was not ashamed. It was the look of a man who has been carrying something for too long and has finally found a place to set it down. He said, "Yes, I was." Weld's redirect was brief and did not recover the ground that had been lost. The recording came in on the 5th day. Connor had filed the motion to admit it on the 2nd night of trial. The judge had initially questioned the manner of recovery, and Connor had filed a supporting brief citing 7 cases in which recovered deleted data had been admitted under comparable circumstances. The digital forensics expert testified about the recovery process in precise technical detail. The judge ruled the recording admissible. Connor played it for the jury without introduction or commentary. He let it run from the beginning. James's voice, steady and deliberate. Harmon's voice, tightly controlled and then not. The moment when Harmon said the people above him would not let James walk away quietly. The moment when James said he had been the kind of man people did not worry about making an example of his entire life. The jury was very still. When the recording ended, Connor let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "The prosecution has told you that James Calloway killed Derek Harmon to silence him. What you have just heard is a man telling Derek Harmon, to his face, that he intended to take documentation of illegal activity to an attorney. That is not the behavior of a man planning to commit murder. That is the behavior of a man who believed in doing what his conscience required." He paused. Someone in this case did not want that documentation to reach an attorney. The question is not whether that person exists. The recording makes that clear. The question is who. He sat down. The answer came the following morning. Marco Reyes had been in Harlan since Monday, staying at a motel on the edge of town. He had not told his wife everything. He had told her enough. She had looked at him for a long time and then said, "You know what needs to be done." He had said he did. She had said, "Then do it and come home." He walked into the courthouse at 8:45 in the morning, before the session began, and found Connor in the corridor outside the courtroom. Connor looked at him. Marco said, "I want to testify." Connor said, "I know. I have been waiting." Marco Reyes took the stand as a defense witness on the 6th day of trial. He described the maintenance order that had not been fulfilled. He described the day of his injury and the meeting with Derek Harmon the following day and the statement he had signed under pressure. He described 3 other workers he had personally witnessed go through the same process. He described the culture at Ridgeline, the understanding, never stated but universally known, that certain things were not to be discussed outside the building. Then Connor asked him, "Did you ever have any reason to believe that James Calloway intended to harm Derek Harmon?" Marco said, "No, the opposite. Mr. Calloway was the one person at Ridgeline who treated workers like people instead of liabilities. He was the one who told me I had rights. He was trying to do something, for me and for everyone else who could not." Connor said, "On the night of Derek Harmon's death, did you see or hear anything relevant to what happened?" Marco said yes. He had been working late that night, finishing a job he had stayed to complete. He had been in the far bay, which shared a wall with the corridor leading to the parts storage room. At approximately 11:15 in the evening, he had heard voices in the corridor. He had recognized one of them. Connor said, "Who did you recognize?" Marco said, "Deputy Ray Colton. I knew his voice because he had come to the facility twice before on what Harmon called routine security consultation. The second time, I saw him and Harmon go into the back office together and close the door." Connor said, "What did you hear in the corridor that night?" Marco said, "I heard Harmon say that he was not going to keep doing it, that it had gone too far, that he was going to talk to someone." A pause. "And then I heard Colton tell him that was not going to happen." The room was very quiet. Marco said, "I should have said something sooner. I was scared. I had my daughter to think about. I know that is not a sufficient reason, but I am saying it now. Connor stood for redirect after Weld's cross-examination. He asked one question. Mr. Reyes, is there any personal benefit to you from testifying here today? Marco looked at him. Then he looked at James. He said, no. I am here because it was the only honest thing left to do. I learned what that looks like from watching someone else do it first. Connor immediately filed a motion requesting that the court issue a subpoena for Deputy Ray Colton's communications and movements on the night of the murder, citing Marco's testimony as grounds. The judge granted it within the hour. The case against James Calloway came apart in the measured, irreversible way that structures come apart when the foundations are shown to be compromised. The digital forensics testimony, combined with the entry log anomaly, made the card data inadmissible. The security footage, once Connor established that the jacket visible in the frame was standard issue equipment worn by every employee on the floor, lost its identifying value. Pete Solis's testimony, following his admission of coercion, was struck from the record. What remained was a recording of a man stating his intention to expose illegal activity, an eyewitness placing Deputy Ray Colton at the scene of the crime at the time it occurred, and a web of financial connections linking Frank Aldridge to falsified evidence and suppressed testimony. Patricia Weld requested a recess. She emerged from the judge's chambers 40 minutes later and announced that the prosecution was withdrawing its case against James Calloway, pending a review of new evidence. Deputy Ray Colton was taken into custody that afternoon. Frank Aldridge was arrested the following morning. The investigation that followed would produce indictments against 6 individuals, including 2 members of the county sheriff's office who had helped construct the evidence file against James. Pete Solis cooperated fully. Connor filed a letter with the court recommending leniency in light of the coercion Pete had faced. Marco Reyes's workers' compensation case was reopened. So were the cases of the other workers whose claims had been falsified. James Calloway was called to the stand one final time before the prosecution withdrew. Connor asked him why he had not delivered the documentation sooner. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was afraid. Not for myself. I was afraid that if I made myself a target, my children would be the ones who paid for it. I had spent 21 years trying to give them a future that was not complicated by the difficulties of my life. I did not want to be the reason that future became harder. Connor stood very still. He asked, and why did you decide not to take the plea agreement? James looked at his children. He said, because I spent 21 years teaching them not to let fear make their choices. I taught them that what was true was worth standing for, even when it cost something. I could not sit in that chair and ask them to stand for me while I chose differently. I could not be the man who taught them that lesson and then refuse to live by it on the day it mattered most. The courtroom was silent. Lily, in the press area, had stopped writing. James Calloway walked out of the Harlan County Courthouse at 4:17 in the afternoon on a Thursday in November, into air that was cold and clean and carried the particular smell of the Georgia fall, dry leaves and distant wood smoke, and the mineral quality of cold pavement. He stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and looked at the town around him, at the hardware store across the street that had been there since he was in his 20s, at the water tower visible above the rooflines to the east, at the parking lot of the diner where he had eaten breakfast on his way to work for the better part of 2 decades. Connor was beside him. Lily was beside him. Connor did something he had not done since he was a child. He put his arms around James, without prelude, without ceremony, the way a person reaches for something they have nearly lost. He held on. And in front of the small crowd gathered at the foot of the courthouse steps, former colleagues, neighbors, Marco Reyes, and his wife, Connor said one word against his father's shoulder. He said, Dad. James stood very still for a moment. He put his arms around his son and held him back, and did not let go for a long time. Lily's article ran 6 weeks later, in the Sunday edition of the paper and simultaneously online. The headline she chose was not about the murder charge. It was not about the corruption ring or the arrests or the settlements that followed. She called it, The Man Who Stayed. It began not with the trial, but with a night in late October, 21 years earlier, when a man working late in a repair shop found 2 children hiding in a broken-down truck in the back lot. It described the wooden chair placed outside a bedroom door. It described a manila folder worn soft at the corners, carried in a jacket pocket for 15 years, containing proof of a family that the world had not been willing to simply take on faith. It described a man who had been afraid his whole life, afraid to love again after loss, afraid that his love would become a burden, afraid that the color of his skin would make his children's lives harder simply by association with him. A man who had been afraid, and who had stayed anyway. It ended simply. The children he raised grew up to stand in a courtroom and refused to let the world take him. They had learned from him that the people worth fighting for are the ones who were there when fighting was not required. He had been there every morning. He had been there every night. He had sat outside a door in the dark and waited, and in doing so had taught two frightened children the only lesson that matters, that some people do not leave. James Calloway did not ask to be a father. He chose to be one. And on the day the world tried to take everything from him, his children chose him back. That is what family is. The house on Clement Street looked the same as it always had. The porch was slightly wider than it had been when Connor and Lily were children. The garage door still stuck on cold mornings. The kitchen still smelled of coffee and the faint background note of machine oil that had worked its way into the walls over 20 years of James coming home from the shop and washing his hands at the sink. Connor arrived first, the Saturday after Thanksgiving. He brought groceries and a bottle of bourbon he had been saving for an occasion he could not previously have specified. Lily arrived an hour later, carrying a bag she had clearly packed in a hurry and a box of files she had been meaning to drop off for 3 weeks. They made dinner together in the kitchen the way they had when they were teenagers, inefficiently, loudly, with the specific comfortable chaos of people who know each other well enough not to worry about getting in each other's way. James sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched them. At some point during the evening, after dinner had been eaten and the bourbon had been opened, and the conversation had moved from the logistics of the coming months to older and quieter things, Connor went out to the garage and came back carrying the wooden chair, the one that had sat outside their bedroom door on the first night. James had kept it all these years, moved it from the hallway to the garage to the back of a storage shelf, the way you keep things that have no practical use but cannot be thrown away. Connor carried it out to the porch and set it down. The three of them went outside. The night was cold and clear. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a dog was making a companionable noise. Above the roofline, a few stars were visible despite the light from the town. James sat in the chair. Connor sat on the porch railing. Lily sat on the top step with her jacket pulled around her. Nobody said anything for a while. There was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said, or that could be better expressed than the silence between people who have come through something together and arrived, against reasonable odds, at the other side of it. James looked at the street. He thought about the night he had first sat in this chair, outside a different door, in a different darkness, listening to the rain and asking himself what he was doing. He had not known then what the answer was. He had only known that the question had a right side and a wrong side, and that the right side required him to stay. He had stayed, and they had stayed. And here, on a cold Saturday night in November, in a town that had tried to reduce him to a single terrible image and failed, James Calloway sat on the porch of the house he had owned for 27 years with his 2 children beside him, and felt something he had been afraid of his entire adult life. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He felt, without reservation and without the shadow of loss, he had always expected to follow it, like he was loved. He did not say any of this out loud. He did not need to. He drank his coffee. The night was quiet. The street was still. And the family on the porch of the house on Clement Street sat together in the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of 21 years of mornings and dinners, and arguments and repairs, and the 10,000 ordinary moments that, accumulated over time, become something that no court and no accusation and no fear can ever take away. Something that has another name. Something called home.